Welcome back to the Admissions Uncovered podcast. I usually say it's the college admissions podcast for the students, by the students, but I can't say the by the students part today and in the future because now I'm joined, and hopefully a lot more, by Don Gonzalez, who some of you may know from a very, very early episode of the podcast, but he was a teacher and admin from my high school. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Gonzalez. Thank
you, Michael. I'm glad to be part of it.
Do I get to call you Don now? Is that a thing I can do?
If you feel comfortable doing that, it's always been, it's funny to me. It's my younger students that feel more comfortable doing that, and my students from way back who are now in their 30s and have children still call me Mr. G or Mr. Gonzalez. They can't bring themselves to call me Don.
I don't think I'd call you Don. I think I'll just keep calling you Gonzalez without the Mr.
I'm fine with that.
That's the way I call all my teachers.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's kind of normal because that's the way the teachers talk to each other. That's the way admin talks to each other. And honestly, it's the way I talked to people when I was in the military. Everybody has last name, and I just kind of grew accustomed to that.
So, let me quickly plug the link to your old episode because I think it's a pretty good episode. It's admissionsuncovered.com/322, and I think we talked about teacher rec letters, how to get good ones, which teachers to select, all that good stuff. So if you're looking for some stuff on teacher rec letters, go to that episode or look in the show notes down below. I think the cool thing that you bring is, before it was me talking to Dominic and Neva originally, who were then high school juniors about to do college admissions. And then I did a lot of guest episodes that were a lot with students and things like that. And now I think we can talk about college admissions from this completely different angle, which is how admins approach it, how schools and systems approach it, and something kind of more broad and maybe more meta.
So, my vision for it is that, the times that you come back to Dallas and we have opportunities to talk that, this is something that you and I both share an interest in, and just kind of the intersection of those sort of, your life as a college student and my continued frustrations about the lack of resources at our school in particular, and I seem to hear this from other schools as well, that there's a tremendous need out there, not only from the student standpoint, but from the teacher standpoint, the counselor standpoint. There's a lot going, and I can only speak to public schools because that's all I've ever worked in, that people just don't know what they're doing. It's a shot in the dark.
Well, I think part of that is that, this podcast will obviously still be talking about how to get into college and some of the mechanics, but I think, it'll be imbued with kind of all these more meta questions about, this is what you need to do to get into college, but here's what maybe teachers and counselors and systems can do better. And what that makes me think of is just my experience going through high school. And I was very lucky to have parents who kind of emphasized very early on, you got to go to college, got to go to a good college. And so knowing how to do that, that was a day one type of thing. Got to do extracurriculars. Grades are obviously must have, but you got to do all these leadership-y type things as well. And I actually don't think other students got that message. I really don't. I think everybody gets good grades, but I think the extracurricular activity and the leadership angle is kind of dropped until it's too late.
Well, I don't think we did this when you were a student, and I guess it's been, just 2 years removed?
2 years
3 years
now.
Removed. So, in the last few years, we started an orientation camp as students are coming in.
You had that with me,
and
too.
Okay. Did we do the first one when you were president of NHS?
Well, no, Aaliyah, the president before me.
The year before? Okay, I'm losing track of time. But one of the things that we try to do from the very beginning is start talking to them about college. And so one of the sessions that I give is all based off of Angela Duckworth's book on grit. And there's a chapter in there that she talks about extracurricular activities. And I think she references it as the Harvard model that I always call it the 2x2 model. And it may not be Harvard's model. I can't remember. But the idea of having two or more, of having two, not, like a lot of people think I've got to have 40 different extracurricular activities. And I really stress the need for quality over quantity. And then what Duckworth said in her book is that there are two ways to evaluate quality, and that's demonstrated growth. Like 2 or more years in an activity is part one, and then number two is developing leadership, and the other one is like, being like you and going from just being, a regular debater, maybe when you're a freshman, to being, a nationally ranked debater by the time you're a senior. So that sort of thing. So that's something that we start with them early on and start talking to them about, at our school, I think that College Board actually has a pretty decent list of what you're supposed to do your freshman year. And they may even have it as an infographic now. What you're supposed to do as a freshman, what you're supposed to do as a sophomore, and etc. But what I think the problem is that even AP teachers, I don't think, read that and talk about it. You have like one voice in the darkness talking about it, and it's got to be the entire school culture in order for you not to lose kids. What I was starting to tell you off air is that my concern at our school is that the kids at the very top, for the most part, and the kids at the very bottom, for the most part, are the ones that get served. It's the kids in the middle who don't get served, and those are the ones that are likely to fall through the cracks and not know what's available to them. From not having somebody in their ear from the very beginning telling them what they need to do for college, to getting towards the end and not knowing how to make decisions or how to ask the right questions. They don't even know what questions to ask. And unfortunately, when they go to their teacher, sometimes they're getting bad information. And I think bad information is worse than no information.
I think definitely the teacher point is really true. In my experience, I've had teachers who just say that not even, obviously bad information, very bad, but give like no effort at all and think that college admissions is kind of beyond the scope of their job or their job description. And I've not read like a teacher job description from Dallas ISD, so maybe it's true that like future plans and admissions counseling and job counseling or whatever is like actually just not in their job description. But it seems like an important thing just to know when your student asks you a question about it, to at least either have like a reasonable answer or really do try to make sure that student gets referred to like the actual college counselor or the counselor of that school. I've had so many times where I don't think I've never really asked the question like, oh, well, I guess I don't have an answer. I can never find it. But I definitely know other students who have come to like really like certain teachers, have asked questions and then have gotten nothing from those teachers. So I think it's also a part about making this, like you said, part of the culture, but also part of people's real jobs is that, yes, you get to teach math. Yes, you get to teach English, but you also have to like help your students with college and with your future plans too.
I think you're right. I think that has to be a discussion that's had with teachers from the very beginning when they're going through the interview process of either being asked questions about what they think about the college process themselves. Maybe some of the younger teachers can remember, or most definitely at the point where they're actually being hired and they're being told what their responsibilities are, that it's understood that that's part of the responsibility, that in the individual school, it's not just the counselor or the so-called college advisor, because that's not enough. I don't know what the typical workload is at a regular high school, but like in our school, we have almost 500 students for one counselor, and we have a college advisor, but she's shared with another school, so she's got a load of close to 200 seniors. I don't know how many the other school has now, but our school, we've got 125 graduating. So, yeah, so close to 200. And I know that's not huge compared to some of these big high schools, but that's a lot of essays to be going through and whatnot. One person can't do it themselves. And then when you bring in, there's just got to be a better way, because you know what happens, and I think you've talked about this before, is you have that one teacher that is the popular teacher that everybody goes and asks for a rec letter, and then they get overworked, or they have to be put in a situation where they either A, have to say no to somebody that they wish they didn't have to say no, or worse, they say yes to a kid that they shouldn't have said yes to, and they violate their own rules of how they write their letters, and they write a bad letter. So it's there's got to be a better way to spread it around and make sure that everybody is part of the team. Everybody's got to be part of the college advising team.
I mean, I think without that kind of attitude, you just can't do it well, at least because of how individual college admissions counseling and just generally counseling is, right? Like, I very early on knew that I really liked prestige. I wanted to go to an Ivy League school. I've said this many times. It's just like what I wanted. And so the counseling I needed is very different than someone who didn't really care about that. And it's just, I want to go to UT. That's all I want. Something very different also from maybe someone who wants a similar tier of school that I wanted to get into, but wanted to be an engineer rather than like a econ poli-sci type like me. And so what that means is that you really need individual teachers pushing students to do the activities and the classes that like fit their interests. And you don't get that without some type of personal knowledge and like interest in that kid. So I don't know, like I can imagine systems that would let you do that, right? Like each kid is assigned like a coach or something, or like a guide teacher, maybe.
Because what I've tried to do over the years, I've just kind of ragtagged it by just saying to myself, when I coached debate, it was going to be the debaters. And now that I split my duties and have part of my duties being coaching a mock trial team, mock trial kids are my responsibility. But not everybody does that. And, like the thing that you were just talking about is interest. We joked about this when we were having lunch that time, that you have a student that they're a senior and they're saying they're interested in robotics, but they've never done anything with it during the summer. They haven't gone to robotics camp, or they haven't, done work at a university or anything like that. And it's like, there's no demonstrated interest in that, in that thing that there's, yes. And then they're disappointed when things don't work out the way they want them to.
Yeah. And I think I just have to like say is sometimes it's just very hard. Like I want to blame the kid. I'm like, you should have just like, obviously this is bad, but I say that kind of like knowing that it's bad and kind of knowing some of the ins and outs of this process. It's just not the case that it's obvious, especially if a kid isn't like given options and like, this is actually one of the options, right? If you just like send a kid in blindfolded, of course, like 9 out of the 10 times they're going to end up tripping and stumbling. I don't think that's like totally unreasonable. I don't know. I guess the point I'm trying to get at is that like, I feel like our school was very special in that a lot of kids just ended up in one of 3 activities, and you had teachers, I think, who felt fairly responsible for the kids in their club. But before I went to the law magnet, I came from Allen ISD, which is, if you don't know, it's like this massive high school in the suburbs of Dallas, like 1,000 kids per grade, crazy amounts of like crazy ratios of kids per counselor, kids per teacher. And it was just, in fact, not true that each person kind of had like a teacher they bonded with or an activity they really invested in. Like, I think even if you have really good extracurricular leaders who really invest in their kids' college, planning and everything, you still got to get those kids in extracurriculars at first. I think that's like the original challenge, I guess.
So, in saying that, one of my goals would be, as we move forward in partnering up, or you adding me as a perpetual guest or co-host, whatever you want to call me, is that we attract some teachers who are listening. Because I think that if campuses aren't going to have systems in place as part of district policy, I don't see that happening. I think that most districts think, oh, well, we have a college counselor, we have a college advisor, and we have a high school counselor for each grade. We have satisfied our needs. And that's just not true. And I think if it starts with just one person, it's, very grassroots. If you have somebody that's really motivated by it, and young or old, I'm not the youngest teacher at my school. I'm actually
you're about to retire. Oldest.
But in a couple of years, thanks. But somebody's got to be the one that's pushing the agenda. And, like one of the things that I've done, and part of it is because of the position I'm in, since I'm in now in a pseudo-administrative position, is that I push for every time we have professional development that some of it is geared towards college readiness. Like I've taught teachers how to do rec letters, and encourage them to do more than, just because you heard me talk about it for 30 minutes or an hour doesn't preclude you from participating in the QuestBridge webinars, for example. That's how I taught myself. I wanted to get better at my rec letters because I knew they weren't good enough. And so what did I do? I just, signed up for webinars, and every time QuestBridge sends me another webinar, if I have time, I'll sit and watch it live, and if not, I'll just watch it on YouTube when it posts up. Just doing little things like that, and really investing in their own education, going out and buying books and reading about things that are related to college readiness. So, but I think it can start with just one person. If you sit around and wait for the districts to do it, it's not going to happen.
Hey, it's Michael here. I know you're listening to this podcast because you or someone you know wants to go to a good college. The first step to doing that is getting good test scores, ACT and SAT scores. And the reason why is because that kind of sets the baseline at which you can apply. You're not going to get into Harvard with a 900. Sorry, you're just probably not going to get in there. Now, I actually do a lot of work in test prep tutoring. I have a separate business called GAO Admissions. You can go to the website at gaoadmissions.com. There's going to be a link on the website if you're listening to the podcast on the website. And basically, I help students find their own test prep strategies. So my process is that I first give my students a diagnostic test. Y'all will take it, and then we'll come back together and see what types of questions you're missing the most. If you're missing more geometry than algebra, we know to focus on geometry. But more importantly than that, I'll ask you a series of guided questions that I've used for all of my students in the past, for the past 2 years I've been doing this, to figure out what your key challenges are. That way we can come up with solutions just for you. And on average, I've seen my students increase their SAT scores by 100 to 150 points, the ACT 4 or 5 points on average, which means you'd be more or less than that. I think that this is a really good thing to start and finish by the end of your junior year. If you're younger than that, I think starting early is definitely a good idea, just because the PSAT is also a really important test. The PSAT, after all, is what can qualify you for National Merit Scholarship consideration. And so if you're there and you're ready to start tutoring, please head over to gaoadmissions.com. That's GAO admissions.com. Scroll to the bottom and shoot me an email, and I'll talk to you more about how to get started. Thanks so much. And now let's get back to the show. I think part of that's definitely true. Like, the one part that I think was definitely true is teacher rec letters, because even if you don't think it's your job to, like, handhold a kid into their dream college, or like make sure that kid is doing every single thing correctly, it is at the very least your job, when asked to write a recommendation letter, to actually write a decent recommendation letter. And like, I've seen very bad recommendation letters. I had a student this year who went to a school where the teacher said, I can only use a template for you because I think it would be unfair to add personal elements, because not every student might have those personal elements. I might not have personal stories for each student, which is this absurd thing and results in pro forma like rec letters for everybody in that school. This is crazy. This is a kid I liked a lot too, and so, it gets me very upset. It's just, I don't know. Like, stories like those make me very mad at certain teachers. Like, just take an hour of your time to Google it, and your rec letters will at least be, a little bit better.
And, I don't want to bag on all teachers, but I think that's part of the challenge. And, it comes with the fact that they've got so much professional development that they have to do. They have so much grading that a lot of them aren't self-motivated to go do that extra thing. But, like, my experience has been that, not to belabor the point about rec letters, but to use that as an example is that they just don't know. Like they'll spend a paragraph or two talking about things that are in the
their
transcript,
grades, right? Their GPA.
And you know what? I've got to be honest. I went back, I have saved pretty much every letter I've ever written since I've been a teacher. And I reference some of them. A lot of times I'll reference them if I see similarities between kids, kind of inspire me to start getting the writing going. And the other day, when I guess there was a January 15th deadline. I was writing a rec letter for that. And I went back and looked at a letter that I'd written for a similar student. And I was like, I cannot believe I wrote this.
Was it that bad?
I didn't know. It was pretty bad. I did the exact same thing. I spent, a paragraph introducing my relationship with the kid, which I think is kind of normal. How do you know the kid sort of thing. But then I did a whole paragraph of like their grades and their rank and all of that, which was a waste of space. Yeah. But I didn't know. So
I think that thing, just like I don't know, is another thing that's not necessarily the total fault of teachers and students, because part of this is just like college admissions is this crazy black box where colleges don't tell you exactly what they're looking for at all.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a guessing game a lot of times too. Like tell me what it is that you want.
Like I obviously give advice. Like I do individual college counseling. I do this podcast, so I have very general thoughts and I think fairly good advice. I hope so, at least, for how to get into college. But part of it is just that sometimes you just don't know and you have to like ballpark it.
But you saying that reminds me of another thing that I don't think that we do a good enough job of, and that is, particularly when you start talking to students that are applying to those tier 1 elite schools, is you can do everything right and still not get into the school that you want to get into. And that's just the nature of the process. And I don't think that we do a good enough job of prepping students for the fact that even great students like you are going to get some amount of failure and dealing with that. Because this year I saw my students stress when the early decision and early action decisions were coming out. It was awful. I had one girl that spent the entire Saturday crying. Just didn't even go to work. She had a part-time job. She didn't go to work. And she's one of my strongest students. And so it's definitely a stressful situation. And I think it's only going to get
worse.
So I think that's part of it too. That's something that I've shifted my focus to this year, is what students can do in terms of self-care as they go through the process, like being more mindful and preparing themselves for the fact that no one, you get to read stories. Yes, there are people that this happens to, but most people aren't going to get into 100% of the schools that they're applying to. And, most of us aren't fortunate enough to go to our top choice school. We have, some of us might even get into our top choice school and not be able to afford to go because the financial aid package just isn't the right package. And so that's part of it.
I think like that definitely like counseling aspect of it is something that I don't think we've talked about a lot, but I think is super crucial. Just because, like the admissions rates are just going to keep going down. They're not going up anytime soon. More people are going to apply these colleges, despite, sitting on billions of dollars in their endowment, are not going to expand their class or make more dorms or hire more professors. It's just not in their interests, right? They want education to be treated as a luxury brand so they can keep charging exorbitant prices by keeping it kind of elite and limited. And, I have a lot of thoughts about how maybe we should use our endowments better. But I think definitely like and if you're a student listening to this and waiting for decisions, remembering that your individual actions do not actually matter that much in a system that you don't have a lot of control over how it generally works. Like, obviously you want to do the best you can. You don't just want to like be fatalistic and be like, well, I guess I'm never going to get in. But you also got to keep in mind that, you know, if you don't get in, it's probably not your fault. It's probably not like anything you could have had control over.
Yeah, you said something in that process about the huge endowments. It's, you know, I think that's a great subject for conversation. I actually think Malcolm Gladwell has talked about this in one of his revisionist history episodes, where he talks about how you've got these schools with these huge endowments. They could really afford to just pretty much let a good chunk of students go to school for free.
Absolutely.
And yet they don't. And, you know, and also, like, I think about this every year in December when I get the phone calls and the emails and the letters from my old college asking me to send money. And I'm like, I already gave you money when I paid for my tuition. And you have, you know, it's just, and I know that they have a fairly large endowment, and they have very wealthy people that donate money to the school. And it's just, you know, because it's just, to me, the saddest thing that I've seen are students that get in to schools that they really wanted to go to, and then they can't afford to go to school there. Last year, I had a student get into NYU, and she got into their film program. She couldn't go, and she couldn't go. And this year, I have a student from one of the other schools that's in my philosophy class who just found out Thursday that she got into Caltech.
Wait, whoa.
Yes, and she's worried about getting it paid. And I said, girl,
you got to go to Caltech.
We'll figure out how to, we got to figure out how to get it paid. You know, we just got to trust, you know, as many little scholarships. And I don't know how much you've talked about that too. The little private scholarships that are out there that, you know, those add up. And how important it is to apply for those. I think some people are like, well, why am I going to spend my time writing an essay for a $3,000 scholarship? Well, those things start to add up, and you'd be surprised at how you can just reuse the same essay for different things. And a lot of those scholarships will give the money directly to the student.
So it's also just pocket change for you if you already find other ways, bigger ways to pay for college.
Yeah,
I won't complain about $1,000 in my bank account, you know, in case anybody wants to send any my way.
Well, I don't know what the experience is now, but I know when I went to school that I had at least one or two private scholarships that got paid directly to the school, and they just adjusted my school aid. So the school just didn't give me as much. They just absorbed that. So it's like, what was the point? And I actually made that argument to one of the scholarships, and they started paying me directly the scholarship.
Yeah. Some, like, Columbia definitely still does that. It basically, the technical thinking of it is it decreases your student contribution, but it keeps everything else the same. So if, you know, I have to contribute, let's say $2,200 to Columbia. If I get a scholarship of $3,000, then that $800 surplus Columbia is going to take away from the Columbia grant, is their logic. I don't think it makes a lot of sense, but it's how they work. So, yeah. So if you want small private scholarships, try to get them. Try to look for ones that'll give you the money directly. It'll just be better off in all ways. But I think just like broadly paying for college is something that we have not talked much about, just because I've been very lucky that's not been something that's the central focus of my thinking about college admissions, and that's just because like I have great parents and like we're extraordinarily lucky and well off. I think there's a really interesting like policy conversation to be had about government policy. You know, like Bernie and all his like free college stuff. I know you have thoughts about that, but even more like incremental things.
No, I mean you're absolutely right, because there's got to be a center. I think there is a center for that discussion to me, center ground, because you know I think that there is a point between not helping anybody and giving everybody free. You know, like it was disturbing to me that this was in the news in the last 2 months or so, that people that thought that, they went and worked for nonprofits, or they went and worked for Title I schools, thinking they would get
Oh
all or part of
yeah.
their student loans forgiven, and 99% of them are
Yeah.
being denied. So I think we need to relook at, my idea has always been connecting student loan forgiveness to something like Job Corps or something like that, where you're doing some other sort of service. It doesn't have to be military service. It can be something like Job Corps. And if you can demonstrate that you do that, that earns you some sort of loan forgiveness. And I don't hear anybody talking about anything
Yeah,
like that.
I read that same story about the Trump administration doing that, and it's really just insane because like all of these people were promised something by the government that is now just being like poof, like no more, no more. And I think that's particularly egregious, but I think there's like, I mean, I think about a lot about refinancing student loan debt as like one of the kind of modest incremental reforms that have been talked about. This is also one of the kind of crazy things. Every type of other debt you have, you can refinance, right? If you find a better term for your mortgage, you can refinance that. Car loans, you can do that. You can file for bankruptcy, and all these things kind of either go away or get like reduced, or there's a better payment plan. Except for one type of debt, which is student loan debt. Like you can't refinance it most of the time. It doesn't go away in bankruptcy.
Although there was one case recently in which that just happened. It was a
really?
landmark case where the student loan debt was discharged. I can't remember what state it was in. I don't remember if it was a state court or a federal court of a particular district.
Well, that's actually really, I mean, I really like that.
Yeah, that's something worth talking about in the context of the bigger picture of financing school from a policy.
And I think
standpoint.
even from like a business standpoint, there are such cool models that are emerging. So there's this thing called ISAs, income share agreements, that basically will pay for a student's university, and paying it back. The student pays it back by agreeing to give up a percent of their income for X number of years out of school. And so if they don't make more than a certain amount, they pay nothing. And it could end up being a very good deal for the issuer of the ISA, obviously, if the student ends up being a banker, or like some really, really, fancy job with a lot of money.
So it's like investing in somebody's
Exactly.
potential future. So this isn't the indentured servant thing where I pay for you to go to college, but then you have to work for me for X number of years until you pay off what I...
No, that's
right, that's a thing.
I think some like lefty, like I'm like people who like listen to this podcast know I'm Elizabeth Warren fan, I'm a liberal, but there's definitely some people on like my side who think ISAs are still indentured servitude. But to me, like there's a big difference, because now like the issuer of the ISA wants that kid to do really well, because then they both do really well.
Right. And that's capitalism.
It's like a perfect alignment of interests. It's very cool.
Yes. If you do better, my investment pays off more.
And yeah, I mean, I have many more thoughts about this, but yes, I think we should definitely talk more about paying for college too.
Okay. I know that the podcast is primarily about college admissions, and maybe I missed it, but life after you get into college, like what to expect when you get there, the orientation and all of that. Because I know, for example, that in my case, and this was a long time ago, over 30 years ago, that I was the first person in my entire family on both sides to ever go to college. So I had no idea what to expect. Everything from, not knowing how to drop classes, or how many classes I should take in order to stay as a full-time student. And even the social aspects of the college life, because I really do think that that's an important part of the college experience, that there has to be a social aspect to it too. So I'd be interested to have conversations about that, especially when you start getting towards the end of the school year and past the regular part of admissions, when things are kind of dying down a little bit. to introduce some of those topics. I think those might be interesting. I think hopefully people would find those
Yeah, I
interesting.
think that's definitely true. And I think like the other thing that makes me think of is thinking about the work people do during college admissions and connecting that to kind of pre-college planning and thinking about what to do in college. Because in my opinion, if you do college admissions correctly, you kind of create this like really coherent story of who you are. Like you really get to know like what you are actually interested in and what you want to do. And I think that is not something that just gets you into college. That's something useful for just thinking about what you want to do in college and what you want to do after college. Right. So like for me, like I thought a lot about what I learned in debate and like living in suburban Allen and then commuting to downtown, like a little south of downtown Dallas, and like what that made me think about my politics and what that made me think about like inequality. And all those things like have made me think about what I want to do in college. Like now I work with a nonprofit called Matriculate that helps low income students get into college, right? College admissions counseling for low income folk. It's affected my coursework. Like I'm thinking about taking classes that are about like the inequalities in economics and education. There's a class called like there's economic inequalities in education that I want to take, right? And so I think, trying to connect college admissions more broadly to like what you want to do with your life is I think another thing that you can think about.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting conversation. Because I think I have a different view about that than you do as an old man.
Ooh. Generational divides.
Well, I definitely have a different perspective. As someone who had my whole life planned out for myself when at like the age of 7, it went a completely different trajectory. Yeah. But that's not to say that the things that you do right now don't inform or form the things that you do later on in life. I think that would be a really interesting conversation.
I think also just like the importance of college, you're like, to me, it's the most important thing right now because I'm in it. Like I can't imagine not being a college student, like what I would be doing otherwise. But I think just like thinking about situating college's importance within like an entire like 80, like a full lifetime, and what does college actually, like 4 years actually mean to like the future? Because like a lot of people I think like college is like the most important time, it's going to define everything. It's certainly what people say to themselves during college admissions, and whether that's true or not I think is like yet to be seen.
Hey, did you guys ever have a episode talking about gap years? Because there seems to be, at least from what I've seen, there's a growing trend of deferring people to spring acceptance rather than just completely rejecting them, and students having to decide what they're going to do with that semester, whether they go to community college or go to a local college, or what they're going to do. Did y'all cover anything like that in previous episodes?
I remember talking about it, in fact wanting to interview a friend of mine who's on a gap year, but I don't think it ever happened.
So that might be interesting, because there may be people that listen to the show that happens to, and the different options that they have available to them.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the segue like that makes me think about is because that case I think is like the Harvard Z-list case, where you're deferred into the spring or even the next year, and right. That often happens with very rich legacy kids in Harvard's case at least. So I think like that just like makes me think about some of the stuff that's underlying maybe the conversation about lack of resources and certainly public schools for college admissions, about like the role money plays in all of this too. But I think just also like gap years would be interesting too, because there's also now a lot of programs that are just designed to help people have really good gap years.
All right. Well, it sounds like we've got a pretty good number of topics to cover in the coming weeks.
I like it. I think it's more meta. I think it's broader than just what I've done before. I think it'll make it a lot more interesting.
Well, I hope so.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Admissions Uncovered podcast. I'm really excited about what we're doing here. We're making a little bit of change, as this episode kind of showed, Don Gonzalez is coming on. We're going to be talking about some new topics, maybe more systems-oriented, the structure of college admissions, as well as the topics we've always been talking about, how to get into college. And so if you like the slightly new direction this podcast is going, please subscribe. That way you get all our new episodes right in your feed whenever we release them. You can do that by going to bit.ly/aupodapple if you are on an Apple device. That way it'll take you to iTunes and you can subscribe there. If you are on Android, you can go to bit.ly/aupodroid. That way you can download a podcast app and subscribe there. If you're on the website, I would love for you to get on your phone and download a podcast app. That way it'll pop up on your phone and you can listen to it whenever. And if you want to do that, you can go to any of the links above. Apple, it's bit.ly/aupodapple. On Android, it's bit.ly/aupodroid. So please subscribe. You'll get the new episodes right in your feed. It'll be the most fashionable among the Admissions Uncovered listenership. And I will see you next week.